Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lyft Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lyft Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lyfteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lyfteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I feel privileged and honored to have the co-founder and executive director of Solidaire, Leah Hunt-Hendrix, here with me today. Thanks, Leah, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Total pleasure. And I'm really curious to know a bit more about your work. So maybe in like a free form style, if you could share a bit about Solidaire and some of the projects and activities that you're working on right now, just for context before I ask you some other questions.
Sure. Well, we started Solidaire right after Occupy Wall Street in kind of we had the idea in early 2012, and it took us about a year to get it off the ground. And the concept was, economic inequality is one of the major crises of our time, and philanthropy is not addressing that. It often can't because it's sort of the realm of the 1%. But so organizations that are trying to address economic inequality and trying to kind of tackle the structures that perpetuate it are often really under-resourced. And so we began this as a network of individual donors who really had a passion for this issue and who really understood that we'd all be better off if we address this issue. So we are a network of philanthropists, and we are trying to address racial, economic, and climate justice and the way that those three things kind of intersect. And we do so with a focus on social movements, because we think that when you're dealing with big structural issues like those, you can't really, they take more than incremental change. They require, mass movements that will change the conditions, social conditions, and what's politically possible. So that's who we are and what we do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that work, and thank you for sharing. I'm wondering if you can give me just maybe an example of how any particular project that the network might provide support to fits into mass movement building. Any examples that might come to mind that you think are good indicators?
Yeah, well, I guess it was soon after we got started that Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, and we immediately jumped in to try to support the activism that took place right after that. And so we've been trying to be in partnership and in solidarity with the Movement for Black Lives since then. As we began to do some research, we realized that less than 2% of philanthropy goes to Black-led organizations, and much less to, organizations that are really challenging the power structures. And so one thing we've done is we have a vehicle for rapid response funding that whenever there's a crisis, our members will mobilize and help move resources to be there and to provide bail money or plane tickets or immediate trainings or urgent trainings or other urgent needs. And we also have an aligned giving strategy where we have created a 5-year partnership with this movement, because movements, as we understand them, they go through cycles of, there's a kind of catalyzing moment where they burst onto the scene, and sort of a peak moment where they've organized and they're having an impact. And then there's a period of withdrawal and the media moves on to something else, and there's burnout and exhaustion, and then a period of reflection and strategizing for the next phase. Funders can often be criticized for a fickleness and a kind of short attention span. And so we're trying to understand how to do funding that is in sync with the cycles of social movements. So that's something that we're experimenting with.
We love that approach of listening and then learning through observation of the patterns. And that's something that I really appreciate about, as more I learn about your work, is this observation of how movements operate, how they grow, how they change. And this, in particular, like almost polar opposites, like urgent crisis type funding and support, and then also longitudinal kind of 5-year real deep partnership work. Beyond funding, does Solidaire play any additional roles in supporting movements, maybe sharing information about movements or any convening or connecting, just out of curiosity?
To some extent, mostly with our members. We have a lot of salons where organizers come and break bread together and with our members, and we kind of talk about campaigns or issues or strategies. We do a lot of webinars. We have a summer retreat where we have more time for kind of building relationships in person. But we really see our role is in philanthropy and organizing in philanthropy. We don't try to really take leadership in movements or, kind of exert our own will at all. We try to really focus on the part that we think we can do best, which is help raise resources.
Wonderful. And I just out of curiosity, and if you're able to share from your own experience and in building and supporting building the network, what kind of experiences do you have and or challenges and or maybe ease do you have in recruiting philanthropists to the network? Are some of the approaches, I suppose I'd imagine there's like a self-selecting group who have been looking for such a network, that they're kind of already in alignment with, they have their values kind of clarified, and they know they want to act, and actually being part of a network is probably just a natural step and additive to their process. But I'm wondering, does the network do education for people who can give and or philanthropists, or if not education, at least some type of active recruiting? And is that hard, or is it easy? Or
yeah, a lot of philanthropy or a lot of philanthropic spaces become really big tents so that they can appeal to as many people as possible and raise as much money as possible. And our thought was, let's keep this to be focused on people who are really values aligned, so that we can take action together and not spend a whole lot of time disagreeing or debating. And we have our members sign on to a values pledge, and if they don't really understand intersectionality or the importance of being an anti-racist community or the importance of social movements and direct action, then it's probably not the community for them. If people are values aligned and get those kind of baseline things, then we do have lots of educational opportunities, where we can dig deeper into strategies and into some of the more nuanced debates of movement strategy. But we decided really not to try to recruit people who don't already share that baseline. And what we found is that there are a lot of people out there who do have these shared values and who haven't been a part of other philanthropic spaces, often because maybe they're not progressive enough. And we grow by people finding us and by word of mouth, and our members bring their friends and family. And we really, I have like a personal love for each one of our members. I think each one is amazing. They're all class traders, basically, and I think courageous and humble, and I feel really honored to get to work with them all.
what a gift, and what a valuable process, this idea of a values pledge. I'm very curious to learn more about that and just kind of in enrolling people who are already aligned to move towards action with more rapidity and just ease. So I'm curious also, Leah, if you could comment on within the philanthropic work of race and economic justice and climate justice, racial justice, climate, economic justice. There's a lot of intersectionality in those areas. I'm wondering if maybe you could comment for Next Economy Now listeners in particular, how you see economic justice maybe intersecting with, say, racial justice first.
Yeah, I just think this is so crucial, and a lot of people come to that intersection from different starting points. I think for me, to be completely honest, I came first through economic justice. I think as someone who grew up in a family with some wealth, I was more aware of class differences than I was of the role of racism in America. And so Occupy just really kind of spoke to me, and it really, I learned and grew so much through getting to follow and participate in a small way in the work of the movement for Black lives. And to some extent, those felt like very different movements. But of course, as you're saying, they were so, those issues are so connected. And I'm sure all your listeners know that communities of color are so, by far disproportionately impacted by economic inequality. I don't have the numbers on hand, but the, average asset size of a white family versus a Latino or Black family is just astoundingly different. And I think it's really important to come at, to really not let those two lenses come apart. Like we have to hold them together. And philanthropy so often has these, gets stuck in issue silos, and as if people only have sort of one identity or one experience. And we get even into debates about which is more important, race or class. And I think it's just critical to insist that, it's not a debate. It's a both and it's because of systems, it's because of the ways in which racism and capitalism and patriarchy are function in coordination. And so, I think it's crucial that we look at policies and look at movements that tie all those things together. It's not enough to have a narrative that's just about all boats will rise, we just, that's kind of race blind, because we know that doesn't work, that people do get left behind. And of course, it's not enough to address issues of racism without talking about the ways in which capitalism will, its impact on families and communities. And so I think that's kind of the struggle in the years ahead to me, is how do we forge what I've been thinking of it as an inclusive populism, like a vision of a populist economic agenda that also is really inclusive of immigrants and communities of color, and addresses the ways in which race does play a role in impacting communities.
This vision for an inclusive populism, I think it kind of, many of the people who we meet working in, say, Next Economy circles kind of recognize that that's integral to their maybe even unspoken theories of change, of how they want to see the world, work for everyone with no one left out, and how their work in the economy fits into that. But sometimes we fall short of recognizing some of the strategies in the world of governance or representational governance, or finding the right candidates. And in some cases, there's just a lot of cynicism around that process in general. I'm learning from you, last time we had a chat, about some of the, how integral and important some of that action is as well, in terms of taking action, finding the right candidates in the right places, providing the right levels of support, so that we have representatives that are, from and truly representing the interests of communities that have been socioeconomically marginalized and or oppressed for so long, and having a seat at the table to, a seat of power to introduce policies, ideas. And I'm wondering if maybe you could just speak to how Solidaire, or how you look at some of that work. And if, let's maybe even posit the question, what if somebody from the new economy movement said, wow, they're very cynical, and they said changing government seems to be so ineffective because of how just their observation of how ineffective government is right now. How might you respond about how you hold that piece of the work within the whole context of all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, I think just in the same way that we need to hold race and economics together as a both and, I think we also need to hold economic democracy and political democracy as a both and. I understand the argument that we won't really have a just political system unless we have greater economic equality. And actually, I've just been reading a great book by Ganesh Siddharaman called The Middle Class Constitution, or something like that, but who really talks about how the American Constitution was built on the assumption that we would be a pretty economically equal society, and so now that we aren't, our democracy is falling apart. And on the other hand, I don't know that we'll achieve the things that we want to achieve unless we reckon with political power. Jonathan Smucker wrote a great book recently called Hegemony How To, that kind of tackles a sort of kind of not an obsession, but a tendency towards powerlessness that often characterizes the left, or sort of a neglect of power or rejection of dealing with politics and power, and then we end up self-marginalizing. And so I guess the question, or the strategy I've been thinking about to sort of square this circle, is is it possible that we can create a visionary? I mean, we know that the country is hungry for alternatives, and that people want a vision for the economy, and everyone is struggling and under the burden of debt and scarcity and multiple jobs. So might it be that we're losing because we don't have a big enough vision? And could we run candidates on a really visionary platform, like a job guarantee, or creating a cooperative economy in certain cities? Or I think it's really time to experiment and use politics and use elections as a place to try things out. And another framework that comes to mind is from Movement Generation. Gopal Dayaneni and folks there talk about kind of 3 stages of movements, where there's a period of resistance, a period of building alternatives, and then a period of using political power to solidify those alternatives into law. Because if you don't, then you can lose all that you built. I think with the election of Trump, it's just hard to deny the importance of engaging in the political arena. And, we're seeing that when you lose control of that arena, our regulatory bodies get disassembled, and we just need to be contesting for power there. I think that we'll continue to lose if we don't prioritize our base, prioritize communities of color, prioritize people who are impacted by economic inequality and by debt. I have hope that if we really put forward a vision, that we can make headway both in addressing these issues, but also in taking back power in the country.
Wonderful. So we can leverage kind of the action of our organized communities and our movements, and kind of actually enshrine them in law. If we and it's not in what I heard you say really strongly throughout kind of your work is, we need to move away from these either ors, and it's actually at the intersectionality or in the more whole vision that we find the most opportunity to create that world that works, that the one that works for all life. And I think that's so critical. So I'm deeply in accord.
I'll also just quickly add, one person's work I really admire is that of Jessica Bird, who is now working with the Movement for Black Lives electoral table. And what they're realizing is that they have a base of people who they've, made care about police brutality and criminal justice reform and state violence. And so they're now working to electoralize their base and get activated in prosecutor races and other local races, and kind of take control of the criminal justice system, so that they can, turn police, get community oversight of police commissions. And so I think that's a great example of when a movement stepping into power.
Mm-hmm. I love that example. Right. So I can imagine what could the impact be if we had a more values-aligned set of district attorneys everywhere across this country, what impact that would have. That's just an example. That'd be, yeah. And I do think that some of our allies in the new economy movement maybe miss this opportunity and miss that intersection. So I love that your work has kind of emerged out of some of the new economy movement and looking at these intersections, still firmly rooted there, though, I think, as far as I could tell. I'm wondering if you could share with the listeners a little bit about how you look at things like, say, the co-op economy. I know there's a lot of interest in our listenership around, co-ops as a strategy.
Yeah, well, that was part of my entry into this space. I had just moved back to New York from graduate school, and it was the summer of 2011, and so Occupy started in September. And in early 2012, I met Brendan Martin, who had just come to New York from Argentina, and he was starting the Working World. And there was a group of workers in Chicago who had been occupying their factory called Republic Windows and Doors. And he needed to raise some money to help the workers buy the factory. It was going to be auctioned off, and they wanted to buy it and turn it into a cooperative. So to me, it was, the Occupy, which is symbolic in a lot of ways. It made that was an example that made Occupy concrete. It felt like it hit the ground in a community of mostly people of color who were really struggling for survival and for their jobs. So I jumped into that and got a deep education with getting to walk alongside the working world for a little while in cooperatives. And I think that that space is just right on, that the crucial question is that of ownership. And, there are really important questions about redistribution of wealth, but we have to deal with who owns the means of production, essentially. And there's a lot of enthusiasm right now around a universal basic income, and I think that it's a big idea that could have important consequences. But to me, I always keep coming back to, well, if we live in this economy where people don't have jobs and they need a basic income, then because of robotization and automation, then who owns the robots? And are we going to end up with a small class that has far more than they need, while the rest of society has just a small basic income? So I'm really interested in thinking about, I think the cooperative space is interesting. I'm less and less involved now, and maybe to some extent out of the loop. But I think the question that always came up for me when I was more in it was that of scale, and how do we get from kind of demonstration projects to scale, and how do we create cooperative ownership of mega corporations, and what do we do about things like Uber and Google and Facebook, and that are really consolidating wealth and power? And so I'm not really sure where that's going to go, but I think it is the right question to be holding on to. I think in the interim, I'm also interested in reviving antitrust law and dealing with monopolies, and I think that at least breaking apart some of these companies and breaking apart the banks is a good start. But I think that question of ownership is the right question.
Much appreciated, and I think our listenership of Next Economy Now is definitely in alignment and holding that question as dear as we move into this future. And thinking of like an uncertain future, I'm also kind of curious, and it was interesting to hear how Solidaire also looks at specifically climate justice as one of the intersections with kind of in your focus in this very whole vision that the network is holding. And obviously some of the intersections that come to mind, especially with regards to race and persons of colors and frontline communities that are disproportionately impacted by some of the near-term impacts of climate change, not to mention sea level rise, it's happening around the world. And we have communities that have been pushed to the margins in waterfront communities where they're very settlement, their very communities are at risk in this inexorable kind of process that we're seeing play out. But then there's the emergent stuff, what's happening in, of course, Puerto Rico and Houston, and then even near to where I am here in the Bay Area in Sonoma County, we have so many undocumented workers who have lost their homes, lost their livestock, lost their livelihood, and are in this very dire circumstance. And I'm curious if these themes of, and so there's obviously like short-term emergent needs, and then there's long-term support. How with climate justice and this idea of movement building and the work you've done in understanding movements, I'm curious if you have any comments or things that you might share with the Next Economy Now listeners about climate justice and how your work, how you and the network think about that, and maybe even an example of some of the work that you may have supported along those lines.
Sure. I think our network is persuaded by the analysis that a lot of the climate movement has spent a lot of money on inside the Beltway strategies to the neglect of building a constituency around climate change. And obviously, it has enormous consequence, and we all need to be, this is something that we all need to be throwing down on. Yeah, the consequences are just going to be disastrous for so many people. There's also such entrenched interests. And so sort of insider strategies come up against, we're spending a lot of money, but we're up against people who also have tons and tons of money. And so the movements kind of play a particularly important role when you have the people who can outnumber the dollars in a way. So I think that a lot of the work that I've seen and been interested in has been around bringing, lifting up the voices of communities that are directly impacted. The Climate Justice Alliance has been doing this, and Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is a group that does fascinating work with folks who are from the coal economy and want to be part of a just transition to a new economy. And I guess the Solidaire network, we were all really involved in Standing Rock and are interested in the intersections of Indigenous sovereignty, land rights, and climate change. And, it's a scary time, and I don't personally know the path forward, but I do think that it requires a mass movement for sure.
So, and I acknowledge, thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate you sharing that there's an unknowing in this. I think we've had a number of thought leaders and other individuals on Next Economy Now who are, vulnerable and humble enough to kind of admit that we don't know the pathway forward in many of these cases. And if we're, looking carefully and observing how movements work and how change happens over time, that's where we feel there's enough information to take action, but there's tremendous amount of unknowing. There's just not, nobody really has the answers, it seems to us, but I appreciate you acknowledging that and sharing that as well. That humility is important, I think. The thing that I'm seeing is the maybe unique or extremely rarefied in your work is how whole the vision is. You're doing, organizing groups that are supporting groups that are doing kind of base building. and you're not marginalizing like direct action or saying no, like protest and supporting crisis opportunities where there's a potential to potentially reclaim power or at least to stop something. You're not saying no to that. You're not marginalizing direct action, but at the same time, you're also, building capacity for systemic change over the long term, enshrining it both into governance and into economic structures of representation and ownership. I think it's really rare. Who do you look to for inspiration? You've mentioned a couple of books and authors, which is really interesting, and I think our listeners really value that type of reference pointing. It's not common for us to see so whole of a vision for moving into the world that we'd love to see happen. And I'm curious, maybe, to know if there's anybody that you look to, books, authors, thought leaders that you might share with our listeners.
Oh, that's such a good question. Gosh, I mean, there's so many, and it's been so many years of study, really. I've just been kind of obsessed with these questions for so long, and it's hard to remember a pinpoint. But, one movement ally who I think has been influential in my thinking is Carlos Saavedra, who, as well as Paul and Mark Engler, who wrote a book called This is an Uprising. And Carlos was also really involved in doing trainings, getting out a theory of organizing and movement building, and how to combine deep organizing in communities with mass escalation that can change a whole national narrative and national conversation, and how that's crucial as, to open up space to then move on policy or other parts of the process of change. So that was really crystallizing for me. I mean, it's a great question. I did a PhD in a program called Religion, Ethics, and Politics. So I had a number of years where I got to think about social movements and history, and the topic I wrote on was the history of the concept of solidarity and how we create collective identities and a sense of who we are, and which can then enable us to take action together, and how we create a sense of the them or the other, and do we have to always have an other that we're kind of fighting against? And a lot of that helps me realize that our identities are not just given, we really create them, and politics and social movements are the space in which we create these collective identities. And so getting to think about that strategically, like, who do we want to be, and what opportunities will that open up or foreclose for us if we define ourselves in a certain way? Like, Occupy was a fascinating experiment in creating an us-them, like the 99% versus the 1%.
I was just thinking about that as you were talking. That's the first example that came to mind. Yeah.
But they also created another identity, which was the occupier. And that was really hard to relate to. Like, very few people identified it as an occupier. And so the movement had like some there was some narrative brilliance in it, and other pieces that weren't as strong. But I guess like those kinds of concepts and are part of what orient my work. I'd also invoke like Taj James from the Movement Strategy Center, and Gopal Dayaneni from Movement Generation. A lot of folks who are thinkers, but they are rooted in movements, and then translate a lot of that into, they can do the theorization coming out of that practice. Also, my favorite philosopher is Aristotle, who writes a lot about the virtues we need to be good citizens, and the virtue of friendship, which is crucial for a healthy political society. And that had a big influence on my life as well.
Thank you for sharing those resources and reference points. I think our listeners will greatly enjoy those. When we post this, we'll make sure to put some links. And in the spirit of that, and additional kind of resources or references, maybe a last kind of question would be, looking at your work now in in support of the movement for Black Lives and what the Solidaire network is accomplishing and supporting. Is there anything that our listeners should be aware of that we can take action? There are some people who are our listeners who are philanthropists, so maybe we could direct them to the network if they're not already aware of it. And then also maybe there's certain grantees that there's some timeliness. I'm not sure exactly when this podcast will be posted. So by timeliness, I mean maybe, late 2017 or early 2018 type of things that we should be aware of that we can jump in and support on, or any other requests that you have of our listeners.
Yes, if you are involved in philanthropy, definitely don't hesitate to reach out and join us. And if you are involved in social movement work or direct action and organizing, we have a grant cycle. We have an R&D fund where we give grants to innovations in movement building, and that happens twice a year. This fall cycle just closed, but it'll be opening back up in the spring. We'd love for you to apply, and you can find out how on our website. And I just want to thank all of you, for you, Kevin, and all of the listeners for all the great work that everyone is doing, because it just, it takes us all doing our part and just finding the role we can play in this big ecosystem. And none of us can do it all, but we each can hold down our little piece. So thank you all for your work.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.